Okay, second part, disease causation. Disease was one of the major reasons for this extraordinary change. But we understand very little about why there was change in disease patterns in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. You may think we get it sorted out, but we haven't really. What is disease? Well, the simplest definition is by an epidemiologist called Virchow, V-I-R-C-H-O-W, who defines disease as life under altered circumstances. Pretty general, sounds like we cover almost anything all the time, but it basically means an unbalancing. Something has lost its balance. In order to understand disease, you may have had some of this before, you will have to make various distinctions. I wrote a book on population and disease, and when I approached it, I really knew very little. I had to learn all this. And I didn't realize that there were all these different disease channels. That in order to understand any disease, you have to work out chains of causation that may affect any disease. The first distinction, which I'm sure you know, is between endemic and epidemic diseases. Endemic diseases are those which are permanently present in the population, such as in many societies, malaria, dysentery, leprosy, or epidemic or periodic diseases which sweep across the population suddenly for a few months or years and then subside to erupt again, such as influenza, measles, cholera, and plague. And you will have to understand them in entirely different ways. Another thing that's worth, I think, really understanding properly is that there's a normal pattern that diseases will increase with time. We tend to be lulled into the belief that human history shows the decline of diseases. But if you look at the long history of population disease, you'll find that many the hunters and gatherers and tribal populations didn't suffer from many diseases which became present as population densities grew up. Almost all diseases are encouraged by overcrowding, and they are most likely to strike and cause high mortality when people are crowded together, because this leads to bad sanitation, often to hunger, wretched housing, pollution of water supplies, and so on. So there is, as Martha showed, a curious pattern in human history. As we get technologies which improve our physical world to a certain extent so that we can live together more closely, this only encourages the bacteria and viruses around us to be more active and new ones to occur. For instance, you need very large populations and population density for viral infections such as influenza or smallpox or measles to be sustained or spread. Even a place like Japan wasn't big enough to sustain measles, for instance, even though it had millions of people. It had to be, periodically it was brought in from outside in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's what measles does, it sweeps through a population, kills off lots of people, and then dies out. The host is killed. So you need very dense populations for a number of these diseases. And as I mentioned, as the population increases, it raises the levels of diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, which are associated with the water supply. This seems an unavoidable trap. Again and again, where population had risen and then collapsed, risen and then collapsed through history until this particular point in time. The rise and fall of ancient civilizations in many European and Asiatic societies can be seen in terms of the rise of the negative feedback from diseases. But the diseases did decline. And in order to try and sort out why this was the case and to understand diseases, I discovered through reading some epidemiology and so on, that There are four main ways in which human beings become ill. And if you want to look at any particular disease, what you've got to do is look carefully along the route by which people become ill. Firstly, there are bacterial diseases, which are carried through the mouth in contaminated food and drink. This is the major killer in human societies. The major forms of this are dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Probably, now more people, and I'll come back to dysentery because it interests me. Dysentery is one of the 2 or 3 great world diseases. Half the people in hospitals in the third world are suffering from dysentery. Not just a ton of stomach upset, it's life-threatening and killing. It's the major killer of infants in the first year in those societies. Now, if you're going to deal with food and drink and how it goes into the human life, obviously what you have to look at is human patterns of eating, drinking, and cooking, and contamination of water and food. The second major way in which we become ill are through what are known as vectors, vector-borne diseases. You probably had quite a lot of this in relation to schistosomiasis anyway, but basically these are diseases which are injected into human beings by various vectors, fleas, lice, mosquitoes, snails, flies, and other insects. A fly, for example, and I'll come back to this, carries something like 3 million different bacteria every time it settles on a bit of food. It's likely that 2,000 or 100,000 of those bacteria will be deposited on the food. So there are still bacteria involved, but they're being carried by vectors. And these are affected by a different set of human cultural activities: public environment, housing, clothing, and footwear, and bodily hygiene. Thirdly, there are airborne diseases, viruses that travel short distances when people cough or sneeze or just breathe. These include smallpox, measles, TB, and influenza. As you know, at the moment there's a lot of worry about bird flu, and at the moment it's all right because it appears to go from one bird maybe to one human being, but once it becomes a viral disease that can be spread between human beings, we can possibly get a world pandemic and that killed more people in the First World War in 1917. These are the viral diseases that are most difficult to protect against, and were only reduced by a combination of rising standards of living and a growing understanding of viruses, which led to inoculation and vaccinations. And finally, and when I first used to give these lectures a few years ago, they weren't so important, but they're increasingly important. There are a sort of contagious diseases which are passed from person to person. In the old days, an obvious example was leprosy. Now AIDS is another example, and as I'll explain to you in a minute, prion-based diseases such as CJD, as PRIO, and PRU, which I'll briefly mention.